Most people think the dangerous part of losing a billionaire's bag is what's inside it. They're wrong. The dangerous part is who comes looking for it afterward. Rain hammered the windshield hard enough to blur the red taillights ahead into long streaks across the freeway as Caleb Mercer tightened both hands on the steering wheel of his aging Ford delivery van and glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:42 p.m. Sophie was asleep in the back seat beneath a gray blanket, her small shoes kicked off beside a half-finished juice box and a stuffed white rabbit with one ear bent sideways from years of being carried everywhere. Caleb adjusted the heater lower so the engine would stop making that high whining sound it made whenever the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. The van smelled faintly like wet cardboard and coffee. Outside, downtown Chicago glowed through the storm in silver reflections and blurred glass towers. The kind of night where rich people disappeared behind tinted windows while everyone else just tried to get home safely. Caleb almost missed the bag. It lay near the shoulder 2 lanes ahead, black leather spinning once across the wet pavement before sliding against the concrete divider. At first he thought it had fallen from a motorcycle or maybe flown from the back of a truck, but then he noticed the black Escalade disappearing around the exit ramp without slowing down. The bag had come from there. Caleb checked his mirrors, eased the van onto the shoulder, and stopped beside the divider with the hazard lights blinking yellow against the rain. He looked back once at Sophie, still asleep. He pulled his hood over his head and stepped into the storm. Water soaked through his jeans immediately as trucks roared past close enough to shake the van. The bag was expensive. He could tell before he even touched it. Heavy leather, gold zipper, no scratches. The kind of thing that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Caleb carried it back into the van and shut the door against the sound of the freeway. Sophie shifted slightly under the blanket but didn't wake up. "Everything okay?" she murmured softly. "Yeah, bug," Caleb said. "Go back to sleep." He rested, the bag on the passenger seat. For a moment, he considered driving straight to the nearest police station. That should have been the end of it. Then he noticed something strange. The zipper was partially open, just enough to expose the corner of a dark red passport tucked inside. Caleb frowned. Passports. Plural. He hesitated before pulling the zipper another inch. Inside sat stacks of $100 bills bundled with black security bands, a silver handgun case still locked shut, 3 passports with different names, and a small red USB drive with something dark dried across one edge. Caleb's expression changed instantly. Not fear, not shock, recognition. The quiet look of a man realizing he had just touched something that did not belong in ordinary life. Sophie sat up slowly in the back seat, rubbing one eye. "Daddy," she whispered. Caleb closed the bag immediately. Too late. Through the rain-streaked windshield, headlights appeared in the side mirror. Black SUV. No headlights at first, then suddenly on. The vehicle slowed behind the van without passing. Sophie noticed Caleb staring into the mirror. "Do they need help?" she asked quietly. Caleb didn't answer right away. Outside, the SUV remained motionless in the storm 20 feet behind them, engine running. Then the driver's door opened. The man who stepped out of the SUV wore a charcoal overcoat despite the rain and moved with the calm efficiency of someone used to entering rooms where everybody else became nervous first. Caleb watched him through the side mirror without starting the van. The stranger stopped beside the driver window and knocked twice with one gloved finger. Not aggressive, not friendly either. Caleb lowered the window barely 2 inches. Cold rain hissed through the gap immediately. The man's eyes dropped once toward the black leather bag on the passenger seat before returning to Caleb's face. "That bag belongs to my employer," he said evenly. His voice carried the polished tone of private security or high-level corporate staff, the kind trained never to sound emotional under pressure. Caleb kept one hand near the ignition. "Then your employer should not throw things onto the freeway." The man ignored the comment. "We can take it from here." Sophie leaned slightly forward from the back seat, still wrapped in her blanket. The stranger noticed her immediately. Something subtle changed in his expression, then disappeared just as fast. "You have your daughter with you," he said quietly. "This does not need to become complicated." Caleb looked at him for another second before reaching for the bag. He did not hand it over. "Who does it belong to?" The man hesitated. Tiny pause. Tiny mistake. Madeline Pierce. Caleb knew the name instantly. Everybody in Chicago did. Pierce Global Holdings owned half the skyline downtown. including the luxury hotel district near the lake and 3 media companies that seemed to appear constantly on financial news channels. Madeline Pierce herself showed up on magazine covers with the same expression every time. Calm. Untouchable. The youngest billionaire in Illinois. Caleb glanced once at the bag again. Passports. Cash. USB drive. Something about it felt wrong now in a way he could not fully explain. The man extended his hand slightly. Please. Caleb's eyes moved past him toward the SUV. Dark windows. Running engine. Another silhouette inside the passenger seat. Watching. No, Caleb said calmly. The man blinked once, surprised more by the refusal than the tone. Excuse me. I will return it myself tomorrow morning. Rainwater rolled down the man's jawline as the silence stretched between them. Behind him, the SUV headlights reflected off the wet freeway barriers in sharp white streaks. Sophie tugged lightly on Caleb's sleeve from the back seat. Daddy, she whispered carefully, why does he look scared? The man heard that. Caleb saw it in his face immediately. Not anger, not offense. Fear. Very small, very controlled, but real. The stranger straightened slightly and stepped back from the window. Mr. Mercer, he said. Caleb froze. He had never given his name. The man continued before Caleb could speak. Take your daughter home tonight. Bring the bag to Pierce Tower tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Ask for executive security. Another pause. And do not open the USB drive. Then he turned and walked back toward the SUV without another word. Seconds later, the black vehicle pulled away into the rain and disappeared between the traffic lights downtown. Sophie stared out the rear window after it vanished. How did he know your name? She asked softly. Caleb did not answer immediately. He started the van instead and pulled back onto the freeway, hands tied on the wheel now. 15 minutes later, they reached their apartment building on the north side. A narrow brick complex squeezed between a laundromat and a closed pharmacy with flickering blue neon lights in the windows. Caleb carried Sophie upstairs asleep against his shoulder while the black leather bag hung from his other hand heavier than before. Much heavier. Inside the apartment, he laid Sophie carefully on the couch beneath a blanket while rain tapped softly against the windows. Then he placed the bag on the kitchen table and stared at it alone in the dim yellow light. The zipper was still partially open, and from inside the bag, faint but unmistakable, came the blinking red light of the USB drive. By morning, Caleb had convinced himself the blinking red light inside the bag meant nothing. Rich people carried strange technology all the time. That was what he told himself while standing in front of the bathroom mirror shaving carefully with a razor that had probably lasted 2 months longer than it should have. But every few seconds his eyes drifted toward the kitchen table. The bag sat exactly where he had left it. Quiet. Closed. Waiting. Sophie sat cross-legged on the couch eating dry cereal from a plastic bowl while cartoons played softly in the background. Are we still going downtown? She asked. Caleb nodded once. Just for a few minutes. To see the scary rich lady? He looked at her. You are not supposed to call people scary. Sophie shrugged slightly. She sounded scary. Caleb could not argue with that. 40 minutes later, his old van rolled into downtown Chicago beneath steel-gray clouds and cold morning wind coming off Lake Michigan. Pierce Tower rose above the financial district like a piece of polished black glass, 52 floors tall, with silver lettering across the entrance that reflected sunlight. Sharp enough to hurt the eyes. Luxury sedans lined the curb outside, while men in tailored coats stepped through revolving doors holding coffee cups that probably cost more than Caleb's lunch budget for a week. Caleb parked 3 blocks away because the parking garage charged $38 before noon. Sophie held his hand tightly as they crossed the street toward the building entrance. The black leather bag hung from Caleb's shoulder now. He noticed people looking at it. Or maybe he was imagining that. Inside, Pierce Tower smelled like marble, expensive perfume, and fresh coffee beans. The lobby ceiling stretched 3 stories high with silent digital screens displaying stock prices and company logos across glowing blue panels. A pianist somewhere near the executive lounge played soft jazz nobody seemed to actually hear. Caleb approached the front desk calmly. The receptionist looked up once and immediately performed the subtle visual scan rich buildings always seem to teach their employees. Shoes. Jacket. Cheap watch. Child beside him. Her smile tightened politely. Can I help you? Caleb set the bag gently on the counter. I was told to bring this to executive security. The woman's expression changed instantly. Not dramatically, just enough. Her fingers stopped moving across the keyboard. One moment, please. She picked up the desk phone without taking her eyes off Caleb. Sophie leaned closer to him. Everybody in here whispers, she said quietly. Caleb almost smiled. Two security officers appeared less than 30 seconds later. Both wore dark suits instead of uniforms. One of them focused entirely on the bag, while the other studied Caleb like a problem he had not solved yet. Mr. Mercer? The taller guard asked. Caleb did not react outwardly to hearing his name again. Yes. Please come with us. They were escorted across the lobby toward a private elevator separated from the public area by frosted glass walls. Employees nearby pretended not to stare while absolutely staring. Sophie noticed it too. Daddy, she whispered softly. Did we do something wrong? No, Caleb said. Then why does everybody look nervous? Before he could answer, the elevator doors opened. The woman standing inside looked exactly like the magazine covers. Madeline Pierce wore a charcoal gray coat over a black dress with no jewelry except a silver watch against her wrist. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly, and her expression carried the controlled stillness of someone who spent her life hiding stress from entire rooms full of people. She looked first at the bag, then at Caleb, then finally at Sophie. You brought her, she said quietly. Caleb met her eyes evenly. I was not leaving my daughter alone after last night. Something unreadable flickered across Madeline's face. Not annoyance. Not apology either. Fair enough, she said. Then her eyes moved back to the bag again. Tell me something honestly, Mr. Mercer. The elevator doors remained open beside her while the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. Did you look inside? The question hung in the air long enough that even the elevator operator near the back stopped breathing normally. Caleb looked at Madeline Pierce without lowering his eyes. Most people around powerful money either stared too hard or avoided eye contact completely. Caleb did neither. Enough to know somebody was looking for it very badly, he answered. Madeline studied him for another second, then stepped aside inside the elevator. Come with me. The doors closed quietly behind them. As the elevator climbed, the city dropped away beneath sheets of gray cloud and mirrored skyscrapers. Sophie stood close against Caleb's side holding her stuffed rabbit, while soft instrumental music played through hidden speakers overhead. Nobody spoke during the first 20 floors. The silence itself felt expensive. At the 34th floor, the elevator stopped briefly, but nobody entered. Caleb noticed one of the security guards glance toward Madeline for instructions. She shook her head once without speaking. Keep going. The elevator resumed upward. Sophie finally looked up at Madeline. Are you the owner of this whole building? The question would have embarrassed most adults. Madeline answered immediately. Technically, the shareholders own most of it. Sophie considered that carefully. That sounds lonely. One of the guards almost smiled before catching himself. Madeline did not react outwardly, but Caleb noticed her eyes shift briefly toward the little girl. The elevator opened onto the executive floor. Everything upstairs was quieter. Thicker carpet, dark wood walls, glass offices overlooking the skyline. Employees moved with the tense focus of people constantly aware they were close to power. Several heads turned the second Madeline stepped out beside Caleb and Sophie. Then their attention locked onto the black leather bag. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Caleb noticed that immediately. Fear again. Not curiosity. Fear. Madeline led them through a long corridor toward a private conference room surrounded by smoked glass walls. Inside waited 3 people already seated at the table. An older attorney with silver hair, a sharply dressed executive Caleb recognized from financial television, and the man from the freeway the night before. The moment Caleb entered, the attorney stood too quickly. You recovered it? He asked. Not hello. Not thank you. Just that. Madeline ignored him. Everyone out except Mr. Harlan. The executive opened his mouth slightly. Madeline, with respect, we should discuss this privately before, now. Her voice never rose. It did not need to. Within seconds the room emptied except for Caleb, Sophie, Madeline, and the man from the freeway whose name apparently was Harlan. The door shut behind them with a soft click. Madeline finally sat down at the far end of the conference table and folded her hands together carefully. For the first time since Caleb met her, she looked tired. Not physically, deeply. The kind of tired that settles into people who have not trusted anyone in a very long time. Open the bag, she said quietly. Caleb hesitated once before placing it on the table and pulling the zipper fully open. The contents spilled into view under the conference room lights. Bundles of cash, passports, documents, the red USB drive blinking faintly beside them. Sophie stared at the passports. Why does one person need 3 names? Silence. Harlan looked away immediately. Madeline did not. Caleb noticed that too. She had the expression of someone already calculating damage before disaster officially arrived. Then Caleb's eyes stopped on something half hidden beneath a folder near the bottom of the bag. A photograph. He pulled it free slowly. The picture showed an older man standing beside a young girl on a sailboat somewhere sunny and warm. The man wore sunglasses and smiled directly into the camera. Caleb recognized him instantly from newspapers and business magazines across the country. Richard Pierce, Madeline's father, dead for almost 2 years. But it was not the man that froze the room. It was the girl standing beside him. Because the child in the photograph was not Madeline. The room went completely silent in the strange way expensive rooms sometimes do, where even the air conditioning seemed afraid to make noise. Caleb looked from the photograph to Madeline slowly. She had not moved. Not even slightly. But the color had drained from her face so fast, it was almost unsettling to watch. Harlan stepped forward immediately. Give me the picture. Caleb did not hand it over. Who is she? Harlan's jaw tightened. Mr. Mercer, this is not your concern. It became my concern when someone followed my daughter home last night. That landed harder than Caleb expected. Madeline's eyes snapped toward Harlan instantly. What? Harlan hesitated. Small mistake again. We monitored the recovery location for security reasons. You followed him? Her voice stayed calm, but now the calm had edges. Harlan straightened slightly. We did not know who accessed the contents of the bag. Sophie looked between the adults quietly. You mean you thought my dad was a bad guy? Nobody answered her. Caleb lowered the photograph onto the conference table carefully. The girl in the image looked around 8 years old with blonde hair, tied back loosely and freckles across her cheeks. Richard Pierce stood beside her smiling in a way Caleb had never seen in any public photo before. Not billionaire smiling. Real smiling. There was something handwritten along the bottom edge of the photograph in faded blue ink. For Lily. Summer on Catalina. Dad. Madeline stared at those words without blinking. My father never had another daughter, she said quietly. But the sentence sounded less like certainty now and more like repetition. Something learned. Something practiced. Caleb noticed her right hand pressing lightly against the table as though grounding herself physically. Harlan moved toward the bag again. We need to secure the contents immediately. Caleb looked at him. Then explain why there are fake passports and enough cash in there to buy a house. That information is confidential. No, Caleb said evenly. Confidential is accounting paperwork. This looks like somebody preparing to disappear. Another silence. Madeline finally stood from her chair and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. 40 stories below them, traffic crawled through the streets like tiny streams of light. She folded her arms once. My father died during a sailing trip near Santa Barbara, she said softly. Heart failure. At least that is what I was told. Harlan's expression changed carefully. Madeline. She ignored him. 3 weeks before he died, he canceled 2 board meetings, transferred assets quietly between subsidiaries, and fired his personal attorney without explanation. Her eyes drifted toward the bag again. Then suddenly he was dead. Caleb said nothing. He had learned years ago that silence often made people continue talking. Sophie climbed into one of the leather conference chairs and hugged her stuffed rabbit closer. My teacher says rich people hide secrets because everybody wants their money. Harlan almost looked offended by the simplicity of it. Madeline did not. Sometimes, she said quietly, still staring out the windows, they hide secrets because money is the only thing keeping certain people alive. Caleb felt the temperature in the room change again. Not physically, socially, like invisible walls had shifted position. Then the red USB drive blinked faster. Once, twice, 3 times. Harlan noticed it first. Do not touch that. But Sophie was already staring at the small device curiously. Why is it flashing? Caleb followed her eyes. The USB light was no longer pulsing softly. It was blinking in a steady pattern now. Deliberate. Almost like a timer. Then suddenly every screen in the conference room flickered black at the exact same moment. Harlan swore under his breath. The monitors came back on 1 second later. A video file had appeared automatically across the center screen. No keyboard touched. No mouse moved. Just a black screen with white text slowly typing itself across the monitor. If you are watching this, it means I did not survive long enough to explain it in person. Nobody in the conference room moved. The words remained frozen on the massive screen, while downtown Chicago reflected faintly against the glass behind it like another city existing beneath the first one. Caleb looked toward Madeline slowly. She was staring at the monitor with the expression of someone watching the ground crack beneath a building she spent her entire life believing was stable. Harlan recovered first. Disconnect the network. He moved immediately toward the wall console beside the conference table, but before he reached it, the screen flickered again and Richard Pierce appeared on the display. Older than in the photograph. Thinner too. He wore a navy sweater instead of a suit and sat alone inside what looked like a boat cabin with soft sunlight moving behind him through circular windows. The most unsettling part was how tired he looked. Not sick. Cornered. Richard Pierce rested both hands together and looked directly into the camera. If Madeline is watching this, then certain people inside Pierce Global have already made their move. Harlan stopped walking. Completely. Caleb noticed the color leave his face again. On screen, Richard continued speaking calmly. I did not trust the board enough to leave this inside company servers, and I no longer trust several members of my own executive team. Madeline stepped closer to the screen slowly. What is this? She whispered, though nobody answered because nobody knew. Richard paused briefly on the recording, as though choosing his words carefully. There are offshore accounts connected to Pierce Global that do not belong to the company. The funds were moved over 6 years through shell corporations tied to government contracts, campaign donations, and private acquisitions. Numbers began appearing across the screen beside him. Wire transfers, company names, dates. Caleb did not understand finance at that level, but even he could tell the amounts were enormous. Hundreds of millions of dollars moving quietly between companies nobody had heard of. Sophie stared at the screen with wide eyes. That is a lot of zeros. Nobody smiled. Richard's voice lowered slightly. If you are seeing this, then either I failed to stop them or I was removed before I could finish. Madeline shook her head once. No, quiet. Automatic. The kind of denial people say before they even fully hear themselves speaking. Harlan finally found his voice again. This video could be fabricated. Caleb looked at him sharply. You looked scared before it even started. Harlan ignored him completely. On screen, Richard turned slightly and held up a document toward the camera. One name appears repeatedly throughout these transfers. Daniel Kessler. Madeline froze. Caleb recognized the name instantly from the executive floor downstairs. Daniel Kessler, senior board member, publicly described for years as Richard Pierce's closest advisor. The same man who had been sitting at the conference table when Caleb arrived. Silence crashed into the room so hard it almost felt physical. Then suddenly the conference room door opened. Daniel Kessler himself stepped inside wearing a tailored dark suit and silver tie. His expression controlled, but too fast to be natural. Behind him stood 2 more executives and another security officer. Madeline, he said calmly, you need to shut this down immediately. Nobody answered him. His eyes moved across the room once before landing on the open bag, then on the USB drive, then finally on Caleb. Caleb noticed something immediately. Daniel did not look surprised by the contents of the video. He looked irritated they were being watched. Madeline stared at him without blinking. You knew about this. Daniel sighed softly like a disappointed professor dealing with emotional students. Your father became paranoid near the end. Did he? Madeline asked quietly. Or did he find something? Daniel stepped farther into the room. Madeline, listen to me carefully. Whatever is on that drive can destroy this company within hours if it leaks publicly. Caleb spoke before she could answer. Maybe the company deserves it. Daniel finally looked directly at him for the first time. His eyes were cold in the precise corporate way rich men learned after decades of controlling rooms through politeness instead of volume. You have no idea what you are involved in, Mr. Mercer. Caleb met his stare evenly. Neither did my daughter. But your people still followed her home. That landed. Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly. Small crack. Very small. But enough. Then the video on the screen resumed again by itself. Richard Pierce looked directly into the camera one final time, and said the sentence that changed the room forever. Madeline, if Daniel Kessler is standing beside you when this plays, do not trust him. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the conference room spoke. Daniel Kessler stood perfectly still beneath the frozen image of Richard Pierce on the screen behind him, and Caleb realized something important in that silence. Powerful people only lose composure in private. Publicly, they smile. Publicly, they adjust ties and lower voices and call disasters misunderstandings. But in private, when the room is sealed and there are no cameras to perform for, the truth leaks through their faces before their words can catch it. Daniel recovered first. "This is absurd," he said calmly, though his voice had tightened by half a degree. Richard was under enormous pressure near the end of his life. He became suspicious of everyone. Madeline stared at him. "Did you move company money into offshore accounts?" Daniel sighed softly, as if exhausted by the conversation already. "Every multinational corporation uses offshore structures. That is not what I asked." Harlan stepped slightly closer to Madeline now, subtle but protective. Caleb noticed it immediately. Earlier, Harlan had seemed loyal to the company. Now he looked loyal specifically to her. Important difference. Daniel spread his hands carefully. "Madeline, you are reacting emotionally to manipulated material delivered by a stranger who found a stolen bag on the freeway." Caleb almost laughed at that. Stranger. As though returning the bag somehow made him the suspicious person in the room. Sophie looked up from her chair quietly. "Daddy returned it, because that is what good people do." Nobody answered her directly, but Daniel's eyes shifted toward the little girl for the first time. Something about being forced to stand in front of a child while defending himself seemed to irritate him more than the accusations. "This is corporate business," Daniel said. "Your father should not be here." Caleb met his gaze evenly. "Your people made it my business when they followed my daughter home." Silence again. Madeline finally turned away from Daniel and looked toward Caleb. "Why did you really bring the bag back?" The question surprised him slightly. "Because it was not mine." Even after seeing the money? Caleb shrugged once. Money disappears fast. His eyes drifted briefly toward Sophie. "Kids remember who you were while you had it." Something shifted in the room at that sentence. Very small, but real. Madeline noticed it too. The billionaire CEO who spent her life surrounded by consultants, attorneys, executives, and polished people suddenly found herself listening more carefully to the tired single father in worn work boots than anyone else in the room. Daniel sensed that immediately. Dangerous men always sensed when influence started slipping away from them. "Madeline," he said sharply now, "we need legal containment immediately before this spreads outside the building." "Outside the building?" Caleb asked. "You mean before people find out your dead boss recorded himself accusing you?" Daniel ignored him. "The board meeting starts in 40 minutes. If this material reaches investors before we control the narrative, Pierce Global loses $30 billion in market value by closing bell." Sophie blinked slowly. "How much is $30 billion? Caleb answered quietly without taking his eyes off Daniel. "Enough to make people panic." Madeline walked slowly toward the conference table again and picked up the old photograph from beside the bag. Her thumb brushed lightly across the image of the little blonde girl. Beside her father. "Who was Lily?" she asked without looking up. Daniel hesitated. Tiny pause. "There again. I do not know." Wrong answer. Everybody in the room felt it. Harlan certainly did. Caleb saw his jaw tighten slightly. Madeline lifted her eyes toward Daniel finally. Cold now. Controlled. "You recognized the name before you answered." Daniel opened his mouth carefully, but before he could speak, the conference room doors burst open again. A young assistant hurried inside, pale-faced and breathing too quickly. "Ms. Pierce," she said, "federal agents are downstairs asking for access to executive records." Nobody moved. Then the assistant swallowed hard and added the part that truly froze the room. "And somebody leaked your father's video online 6 minutes ago." The room exploded into motion without anybody technically raising their voice. That was how wealthy people panicked. Quietly. Efficiently. Phones appeared instantly in hands. Security radios crackled alive. Somewhere beyond the glass conference walls, Caleb could see employees moving faster now. Entire executive teams crossing hallways with the tense speed of people pretending not to run. Daniel Kessler pulled his phone from his pocket immediately. "Get communications under control now," he snapped into the receiver. "I want legal injunctions drafted within 15 minutes. Madeline turned toward him sharply. You do not give orders here right now. Daniel looked at her with visible disbelief for the first time all morning. Madeline, this company is bleeding market value by the second. Then maybe somebody should have stopped the bleeding years ago. Silence. Dangerous silence. Caleb watched both of them carefully now. This was no longer about leaked money or offshore accounts. This was about control. About who still owned the room after the truth entered it. Harlan stepped toward the assistant at the doorway. Where are the federal agents now? Lobby security is holding them downstairs, she answered nervously. News vans are outside too. Somebody leaked internal board records online 5 minutes ago. Daniel swore quietly under his breath. Caleb glanced toward the giant screen again. Richard. Pierce's frozen image still sat there above the conference table like a ghost refusing to leave the building. Sophie climbed down carefully from the leather chair and walked closer to Caleb. Daddy, she whispered, are we in trouble? Caleb crouched slightly beside her. Not if we tell the truth. Madeline heard that. He could tell by the way her eyes shifted toward him again. Not billionaire eyes now. Not CEO eyes either. Just tired human eyes trying to figure out which direction the floor was collapsing. Then suddenly one of the monitors along the side wall switched to live financial news coverage automatically. The anchorwoman looked tense already. Behind her appeared giant red numbers falling across the stock ticker. Pierce Global down 19% in early trading after leaked video from late founder. Another headline followed seconds later. Federal investigation possible into executive financial misconduct. The conference room became very still again. $30 billion. Gone in less than an hour. Caleb noticed something strange then. Madeline was not looking at the stock numbers. She was staring at the photograph of the little girl again. Lily. Daniel noticed it too. Madeline, he said carefully now, softer than before. Whatever Richard told you near the end. He was not well. Wrong approach. Caleb saw it instantly. Daniel was trying to rewrite a dead man while standing beneath his recorded face. Madeline slowly lifted her eyes toward him. You knew about her. Daniel did not answer quickly enough. Another mistake. Harlan moved subtly closer to Madeline again. Caleb understood now. Harlan had probably known pieces of this story for years, but never enough to act against people above him. Until now. Until the bag. Until a random single father picked the wrong object off the side of the freeway and accidentally cracked open an empire. Then the conference room doors opened once more, but this time nobody rushed in. A woman entered quietly, wearing a navy federal jacket with silver credentials hanging at her waist. Mid-40s. Calm eyes. 2 agents stood behind her near the doorway. Madeline Pierce? She asked evenly. Madeline straightened. Automatically. Yes. The woman nodded once. Special Agent Rebecca Sloan, Financial Crimes Division. Her eyes drifted briefly across Daniel, then toward the open bag on the table. We are here regarding evidence connected to Richard Pierce's private investigation. Daniel stepped forward immediately. You do not have authorization to access privileged corporate materials. Agent Sloan looked at him calmly. Actually, Mr. Kessler, we received authorization directly from Richard Pierce 14 months ago. Nobody moved. Daniel's face finally lost control completely for 1 second. Tiny crack. Tiny flash of fear. But enough. Sloan reached into her folder and placed a sealed envelope gently onto the conference table beside the photograph. Across the front, handwritten in blue ink, were 7 words that froze Madeline where she stood. For my daughter. Both of them. The envelope remained untouched on the conference table for several seconds because nobody in the room fully understood what opening it would change. Outside the glass walls, Pierce Tower had descended into controlled chaos. Employees moved through hallways carrying phones pressed tightly against their ears while financial news alerts flashed across monitors throughout the building. Somewhere far below them, reporters gathered behind security barricades with cameras pointed upward toward the executive floors. But inside the conference room, all attention rested on 1 cream-colored envelope and 7 handwritten words from a dead billionaire. Madeline finally reached for it with slightly trembling fingers. Not dramatic trembling. Human trembling. The kind people cannot fully control when their entire understanding of their own life begins shifting beneath them. Daniel Kessler stepped forward immediately. Madeline, you should let legal counsel review anything connected to this investigation first. Agent Sloan blocked him with nothing more than a look. I would advise against touching evidence connected to an active federal inquiry, Mr. Kessler. He stopped moving. Caleb noticed how quickly powerful men became cautious once somebody else entered the room with more authority than money. Madeline opened the envelope slowly. Inside sat a handwritten letter and a second photograph folded neatly beneath it. Her eyes moved across the first lines silently before stopping completely. Caleb watched her expression change in stages. Confusion first, then disbelief, then grief so deep it almost looked like exhaustion. She lowered herself slowly into the leather chair without taking her eyes off the page. Sophie leaned closer toward Caleb and whispered, "Is she crying?" He looked carefully. One tear had escaped despite Madeline clearly trying to stop it. "Yeah," he answered softly. "I think she is." The billionaire CEO nodded once to herself like someone finally confirming a truth she had suspected privately for years. Then she looked up toward the room. "Lily is alive." Silence. Daniel Kessler closed his eyes briefly. Tiny reaction, but enough. Madeline lifted the second photograph from the envelope. It showed the same blonde girl from the sailboat picture, older now, maybe 16, standing beside Richard Pierce outside a small house near the ocean somewhere warm. On the back of the photo, Richard had written another message. "Keep her away from the board. Especially Daniel." Caleb watched Daniel carefully then. Not panic anymore. Calculation. Men like him did not collapse publicly. They reorganized. They searched for exits while still pretending to lead the room. Agent Sloan stepped beside the conference table calmly. "Richard Pierce contacted our office over a year ago," she explained. He believed members of his executive board were moving company money through shell operations tied to political influence and foreign acquisitions. He also believed someone attempted to pressure him regarding his second daughter. Madeline looked up sharply. "Pressure him how?" Sloan hesitated carefully. "Your father believed Lily's identity gave certain board members leverage over inheritance control inside Pierce Global." Caleb understood it instantly then. The second daughter was not the scandal. She was the threat. If Richard Pierce acknowledged another heir publicly, ownership of the company changed. Control changed. Billions changed hands. Sophie frowned slightly. People lied over money. Caleb brushed her hair back gently. Sometimes people do stupid things when they're scared of losing things. Madeline folded the letter carefully and looked directly at Daniel. No anger in her face now. Worse, clarity. "You spent 2 years convincing me my father was unstable," she said quietly. Daniel straightened his tie once. "Your father was under pressure. So are you." Silence hit the room again. Heavy this time. Final. Daniel looked around the conference room slowly and realized something Caleb recognized immediately because he had seen it before in completely different worlds. The moment when everyone stops pretending to stand beside someone powerful. Harlan stepped away from Daniel first. Then the executives near the doorway avoided his eyes. Then even the security officers subtly shifted position toward Madeline and Agent Sloan instead. Power had moved rooms without anybody announcing it. Daniel saw it happen in real time. Caleb picked up the black leather bag from the table quietly. The object that had nearly destroyed an empire now looked strangely ordinary again. Just leather. Just zippers. Just weight. Madeline noticed him preparing to leave. "Mr. Mercer." Caleb stopped near the doorway with Sophie beside him. Madeline stood slowly, still holding her father's letter against her chest. "You could have sold everything inside that bag." Caleb shrugged lightly. "Maybe. Why did you not?" Caleb looked down at Sophie for 1 second before answering. Because she was watching. Nobody spoke after that. Not Daniel. Not the agents. Not the executives outside the glass walls. The entire room simply stood there in silence while a tired single father took his daughter's hand and walked away from more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes.